The bark shattered the Wednesday morning silence like a gunshot through glass, transforming Mrs. Carroll's peaceful seventh-grade art class into a scene no one would ever forget. One moment, 23 students were quietly working on watercolor sketches of childhood memories, brushes dancing across paper in gentle strokes, the familiar scent of paint and creativity filling room 114 at Lincoln Middle School. The next moment, Dante, a retired German shepherd with an impeccable bomb detection record, was lunging toward the far wall with terrifying intensity, his massive frame cutting through the air like a missile locked on target. His growls echoed off the classroom walls like thunder, teeth bared in a display of raw canine determination that sent paint cups clattering to the floor and students scrambling for cover behind desks. Standing frozen at the center of this chaos was Officer Daniels, Dante's handler, watching his normally disciplined partner transform into something primal and unstoppable. But Dante wasn't going mad, and he wasn't reacting to a threat that humans could see. The retired K9 was responding to something far more sinister, something that had been hidden in plain sight for over 30 years, buried beneath layers of paint, canvas, and carefully constructed lies. What Dante discovered next would expose a conspiracy so deep and so dark that it would shake the very foundations of this quiet Oregon town and reveal that sometimes the most innocent places harbor the most devastating secrets. As Dante's powerful jaws clamped down on the bottom edge of the mysterious painting, the canvas tore like fabric under a razor blade, revealing something that made Officer Daniels' blood run cold. There, embedded in what everyone had assumed was a normal classroom wall, was a small rusted metal handle, gleaming dully in the fluorescent light like a doorway to hell itself. The wall wasn't drywall at all, but reinforced steel painted to look ordinary, camouflaged to blend seamlessly with the rest of room 114. Mrs. Carroll sat at her desk, hands trembling uncontrollably, her voice barely a whisper as she repeated over and over, "I didn't know that was there. I swear that painting's been in my family since I was a child. My father gave it to me." But Dante didn't lie, and his instincts had never failed them before. Within minutes, the school's PA system crackled to life with an announcement that would change everything. All classes are to remain in lockdown. Until further notice, this is not a drill. As the bomb squad arrived and carefully pried open that mysterious handle with magnetic tools and handheld scanners, a cold gust of air flooded the classroom, carrying with it the musty scent of decades-old secrets. Behind that wall was a hidden room, roughly the size of a walk-in closet, filled with rusted file cabinets, old lockers, a reel-to-reel tape recorder, and stacks of archived documents that would reveal a truth so horrifying it would make national headlines. But what they found in those files would prove that this was just the beginning of a conspiracy that ran deeper than anyone at Lincoln Middle School could have ever imagined. In the heart of Fairhaven, Oregon, where maple trees line quiet suburban streets, and the biggest excitement usually comes from Friday night high school football games, Lincoln Middle School stood as a beacon of normalcy in an increasingly chaotic world. Built in 1983 on the site of a former government building, the red brick structure housed nearly 800 students who walked its polished hallways every day, completely unaware that they were sitting on top of one of America's darkest Cold War secrets. The school had recently implemented a groundbreaking pilot program called Security Presence with Pause, pairing local police officers with retired canine units to create a safer learning environment after a series of disturbing incidents in nearby districts. It was a progressive initiative that parents embraced wholeheartedly, watching their children light up as they petted the heroic dogs during lunch breaks and cheered when the canines performed tricks in the quad. Among these four-legged guardians was Dante, a magnificent German shepherd with steel grey eyes and an impeccable service record that included dozens of successful bomb detection missions across 3 states. His handler, Officer Marcus Daniels, was a 10-year veteran with the Fairhaven Police Department, a man whose calm demeanor and unwavering trust in his canine partner had earned him respect throughout the community. Together, they patrolled the halls of Lincoln Middle like silent sentinels, their presence providing comfort to students and staff who had grown to love the gentle giant with the noble bearing and intelligent gaze. But on this particular Wednesday morning in October, as autumn painted the Oregon landscape in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, something would happen that would shatter the peaceful facade of this small town forever. In room 114, Mrs. Carroll's art class was in full swing. 23 seventh graders bent over their watercolor sketches while their teacher moved between the desks with gentle encouragement, her soft voice mixing with the sound of brushes against paper and the occasional whispered conversation between friends. The room itself was a sanctuary of creativity, with student artwork covering every available wall space except for one corner where a large, imposing painting hung like a dark sentinel watching over the children below. This particular piece had always made the students uncomfortable with its moody depiction of a tattered American flag and shadowy soldiers stretching across a barren battlefield, but Mrs. Carroll insisted it was important, a piece of history that deserved respect and remembrance. None of them could have imagined that this seemingly innocent work of art would become the key that would unlock a conspiracy spanning decades, or that a dog's instinctive bark would expose the lies that had been carefully buried beneath their feet for over 30 years. It was exactly 9:47 a.m. when Dante's behavior shifted from routine patrol to something far more unsettling. A transformation so subtle that only Officer Daniels noticed the initial warning signs that would soon cascade into chaos. The German Shepherd had been lying quietly in his usual spot near the back of room 114, positioned strategically, where he could observe both the classroom door and the students without disrupting the creative flow of Mrs. Carroll's art lesson. His steel-grey eyes had been scanning the room with practiced efficiency, ears rotating slightly as they picked up the familiar sounds of pencils scratching against paper and the gentle murmur of concentrated young voices discussing their watercolor techniques. But then something changed, something invisible to human senses, but as clear as a klaxon alarm to Dante's highly trained canine instincts. His head lifted first, just a few degrees, nostrils flaring as they processed a scent signature that didn't belong in this environment of paint fumes and teenage anxiety. His ears snapped forward with laser focus, and the relaxed curve of his spine straightened into a rigid line of alertness that Daniels recognized from countless missions in the field. The officer felt his own pulse quicken as he watched his partner's transformation, knowing from years of experience that when Dante exhibited this particular combination of body language, something significant was about to unfold. The dog's breathing became more deliberate, each intake of air processed through sophisticated olfactory receptors that could detect molecular traces invisible to any human technology. His tail, which had been resting casually against the linoleum floor, now held perfectly still, frozen in that peculiar position that meant Dante had isolated his target and was preparing for action. Around them, the art class continued in blissful ignorance, students comparing their sketches of childhood memories while Mrs. Carroll moved between desks with gentle words of encouragement, completely unaware that her classroom had become the focal point of something that would soon make national headlines. Slowly, deliberately, Dante rose to his feet with the fluid grace of a predator who had locked on to prey, every muscle fiber coiled with potential energy as his gaze fixed on the far wall where the mysterious painting hung in its ornate frame. His breathing pattern shifted again, becoming deeper and more focused, and Daniels recognized the signs of a canine who had detected something that required immediate investigation. The scent trail, whatever it was, seemed to be emanating from the direction of that dark, imposing artwork that had dominated the eastern wall of room 114 for years. its moody depiction of battlefield imagery casting shadows across the creative sanctuary where children came to express their innermost thoughts through color and brushstroke. What happened next unfolded with the terrifying precision of a military operation, as Dante began his methodical approach toward the painting, with movements so deliberate and purposeful that the temperature in room 114 seemed to drop several degrees. Officer Daniels felt every nerve in his body ignite with adrenaline as he watched his partner transition from alert observation to active investigation mode, a transformation he had witnessed dozens of times in high-stakes situations, but never in the innocent confines of a middle school art classroom. The German shepherd's paws made no sound against the polished linoleum as he moved forward, each step calculated and controlled, his massive frame somehow becoming both more imposing and more graceful as he closed the distance between himself and the mysterious artwork that had captured his complete attention. Students began to notice the change in atmosphere, their conversations faltering as they glanced up from their watercolor sketches to observe the normally docile K-9 officer moving through their classroom with the focused intensity of a missile locked onto its target. Mrs. Carroll paused mid-sentence while encouraging a student's creative interpretation of a childhood bicycle ride, her gentle voice trailing off as she became aware of the electric tension that was rapidly filling her sanctuary of artistic expression. Dante's nostrils worked overtime, processing layers of scent information that painted an invisible map of chemical signatures across the room. But his focus remained laser-sharp on that particular section of wall where the dark painting hung like a brooding sentinel, watching over decades of innocent children. The artwork itself seemed to pulse with malevolent energy in the fluorescent classroom lighting, its depiction of a tattered American flag and shadowy battlefield soldiers taking on new meaning as the trained bomb detection dog drew closer. With each measured step, Officer Daniels rose slowly from his position near the door, his hand instinctively moving toward his radio, while his eyes never left his four-legged partner, knowing that whatever Dante had detected was serious enough to warrant immediate backup, but not wanting to panic 23 seventh graders who were watching this drama unfold with growing concern and confusion. The scent trail was getting stronger now, causing Dante's ears to flatten slightly against his skull. In a display of intense concentration that Daniels had only seen during their most challenging missions, involving complex explosive devices hidden in the most unlikely locations. As the German shepherd reached the base of the wall directly beneath the painting, his behavior shifted into the final phase of detection protocol, his breathing becoming sharp and controlled, while his entire body coiled like a spring ready to release. The children in room 114 had gone completely silent now, paintbrushes suspended in mid-air as they watched their beloved K-9 guardian transform into something primal and dangerous, his steel-grey eyes fixed on the artwork above with an intensity that made the painted soldiers seem to stare back with equal menace, as if decades of buried secrets were finally about to claw their way to the surface. The explosion of chaos that followed happened so fast that human eyes could barely process the sequence of events. But in that fraction of a second, when Dante's powerful haunches coiled and launched his 80-pound frame through the air toward the painting, time seemed to fracture into crystalline shards of pure terror and revelation. Officer Daniels' voice cut through the classroom like a blade as he shouted, "Dante, no!" But his words were swallowed by the thunderous growl that erupted from the German shepherd's throat, a sound so primal and ferocious that it seemed to shake the very foundations of Lincoln Middle School and announce to the world that something monumentally significant was about to be exposed. The impact was devastating as Dante's powerful jaws clamped down on the bottom edge of the canvas with the precision of a surgical instrument and the force of a battering ram, his teeth puncturing through layers of oil paint and varnish that had concealed the truth for over 3 decades. The tearing sound that followed was like fabric ripping under tremendous pressure, but magnified 100-fold as the artwork that had watched over countless art classes surrendered its secrets in strips of canvas and splinters of frame. Students screamed and dove beneath their desks as paint cups exploded across the floor in a cascade of watercolor chaos, brushes clattering like tiny weapons, while Mrs. Carroll's gentle voice rose in a shriek of pure shock and disbelief. But it was what lay beneath the destroyed painting that transformed Officer Daniels's blood into liquid ice and made his radio slip from nerveless fingers as he stared at the impossible sight before him. There, embedded in what every human being in that room had assumed was an ordinary classroom wall, was a small metal handle, rusted but unmistakably real, gleaming dully in the fluorescent light, like the entrance to a tomb that had been sealed for generations. The wall itself wasn't drywall or plaster as it should have been, but reinforced steel that had been painted and disguised to blend seamlessly with the rest of room 114, camouflaged so expertly that no one had ever suspected that this innocent middle school classroom was built on top of something far more sinister. Dante stood before his discovery like a conquering hero, his chest heaving with exertion, but his posture radiating the satisfaction of a job well done, his steel-grey eyes never leaving the metal handle as if he were standing guard over evidence that could change the course of history. Mrs. Carroll sat frozen at her desk, her face drained of all colour as her trembling hands pressed against her mouth and her voice emerged in broken whispers that would haunt Officer Daniels for the rest of his life. "I didn't know that was there. I swear that painting's been in my family since I was a child. My father gave it to me when I graduated college." The classroom had become a crime scene in the span of 30 seconds, and as Daniels reached for his radio to call for backup, he realized that whatever Dante had uncovered was just the beginning of a mystery that would soon consume their quiet Oregon town and expose secrets that powerful people had killed to keep buried. Within minutes of Officer Daniels' urgent radio transmission, Lincoln Middle School transformed from a peaceful educational institution into the epicenter of what would become the most significant federal investigation in Oregon's modern history. The response was swift and overwhelming as sirens wailed through the quiet suburban streets of Fairhaven, their urgent cries shattering the morning. Tranquility and drawing concerned neighbors from their homes to witness a parade of emergency vehicles converging on the red brick building where their children spent their days learning about mathematics and literature. Principal Harding's voice crackled over the PA system with barely controlled panic as he announced the lockdown that would keep 800 students confined to their classrooms, while federal agents, bomb squad technicians, and hazmat specialists swarmed through the hallways. Like a military invasion force preparing for war, the evacuation of room 114 happened with clinical precision. 23 seventh graders ushered out in single file by stern-faced officers who spoke in hushed tones about containment protocols and security clearances, their young faces pale with confusion and terror as they cast backward glances at the destruction their beloved K-9 companion had unleashed upon their creative sanctuary. Mrs. Carroll required assistance from the school nurse as she stumbled from her classroom, her legs barely capable of supporting her weight as the enormity of what had been hidden beneath her father's painting began to sink into her consciousness like poison seeping through her bloodstream. Officer Daniels remained behind with Dante, both of them standing guard over the exposed metal handle as if it were a loaded weapon that might detonate at any moment. The German shepherd's earlier agitation replaced by an eerie calm that suggested his job was complete. But his vigilance remained absolute. The bomb squad arrived first, their heavy tactical gear making them look like visitors from another planet as they established a perimeter around the damaged wall and began deploying sophisticated detection equipment that could analyze chemical signatures and structural anomalies with microscopic precision. Lead technician Rodriguez approached the mysterious handle with the reverence of an archaeologist uncovering an ancient tomb, his instruments sweeping the reinforced steel surface, while digital readouts painted complex graphs across portable monitors that meant nothing to the civilians watching from the hallway, but everything to the specialists who understood the language of hidden dangers. The first attempt to open the concealed door required magnetic tools and handheld scanners, technology so advanced that it seemed like science fiction to the teachers and administrators who had gathered to witness this unprecedented breach of their familiar world. When the handle finally turned with a groan of protesting metal that echoed through room 114 like the voice of history itself, a cold gust of air rushed from the opening with the musty scent of decades-old secrets, carrying with it the antiseptic smell of institutional neglect, and something else that made Dante's ears prick forward with renewed interest. What lay behind that false wall was a chamber roughly the size of a walk-in closet, but as Rodriguez shined his tactical flashlight into the darkness, the beam illuminated something that made every person in that hallway realize they had stumbled into a conspiracy that reached far beyond anything their small Oregon town had ever imagined possible. The tactical flashlight's beam cut through the darkness of the hidden chamber like a sword slicing through black velvet, revealing horrors that would haunt the investigators for the rest of their lives and transform Lincoln Middle School from a place of learning into ground zero of one of America's most disturbing Cold War revelations. The first thing that became visible in that sickly yellow circle of light was a series of rusted file cabinets lined against the far wall, their metal surfaces scarred with decades of neglect, and their drawers sealed with locks that spoke of government-level security protocols designed to keep certain truths buried forever. Rodriguez stepped carefully into the chamber, his boots echoing against the 1970s-style linoleum flooring that seemed grotesquely out of place in this tomb of secrets, while his flashlight swept across shelves filled with reel-to-reel tape recorders, their mechanical faces staring blindly into the darkness like the eyes of sleeping monsters waiting to tell their stories. The antiseptic smell that had rushed out when they first opened the door was stronger now, mixed with the metallic tang of old electronics, and something else that made Officer Daniel's skin crawl with recognition from his military days, the distinctive odor of institutional experimentation that clung to laboratories where human suffering had been reduced to data points and statistical analyses. Agent Sarah Chen from the FBI's Portland field office arrived within the hour, her credentials and clearance level high enough to assume command of what was rapidly becoming a federal investigation of unprecedented scope and sensitivity. The first file cabinet they managed to pry open contained dozens of folders, each one meticulously labeled with codes that meant nothing to the local authorities, but everything to Chen, who recognized the designation system used by classified military psychological operations during the height of the Cold War. Project TS, Unit 14, Debrief Echo, and subject classifications stamped in red ink with the ominous words Confidential Department of Defense printed across documents that detailed experiments so horrifying that Chen's hands began to tremble as she read the clinical descriptions of psychological conditioning protocols applied to individuals identified only by numbers. The discovery that sent shockwaves through the investigation team came when they found a hand-drawn map tucked between two manila folders, its faded ink showing not just the current layout of Lincoln Middle School, but an intricate network of tunnels, chambers, and access points that existed beneath the building like a subterranean city designed for purposes that no educational institution should ever house. Most disturbing of all was the indication on this map that one of the tunnel exits led directly to the local power plant, suggesting that whatever operations had taken place in these hidden spaces required significant electrical power and complete isolation from public scrutiny. As Rodriguez continued his methodical documentation of the chamber's contents, his flashlight illuminated one final detail that would change everything they thought they knew about the scope of this conspiracy. A section of the linoleum floor near the far wall that showed subtle discoloration and what appeared to be the outline of another access panel, suggesting that this hidden room was merely the entrance to something much larger and more sinister that stretched deep beneath the foundations of Fairhaven's most trusted educational institution. The moment that would shatter Mrs. Carroll's entire understanding of her own existence came when Agent Chen emerged from the hidden chamber carrying a small silver locket, its surface tarnished by decades of neglect, but still recognizable as a piece of jewelry that had once been cherished by someone who had no idea they were about to become part of history's darkest experiments. The locket had been discovered in the drawer of an old metal desk buried beneath layers of dust and forgotten paperwork, and when Chen carefully pried it open with tweezers, the black and white photograph inside revealed the face of a young girl, perhaps 10 years old, standing beside a man in military uniform whose stern expression and rigid posture spoke of someone accustomed to following orders without question. Mrs. Carroll was sitting in the nurse's office when Officer Daniels brought her the locket, her hand still trembling from the shock of seeing her father's painting destroyed and the impossible revelation of what had been hidden behind it for over 30 years. The moment she saw the photograph, her face went completely white and her hand flew to her mouth in a gesture of pure horror as recognition flooded through her consciousness like ice water in her veins. "That's me," she whispered in a voice so broken that it barely qualified as human speech. "And that's my father. I remember this photo. I lost it when I was a child." But even as the words left her lips, something far more terrifying began to happen as fragments of suppressed memories started clawing their way to the surface of her mind, like creatures emerging from a deep, dark pond. The fluorescent lights of the nurse's office suddenly seemed too bright, too harsh, and Mrs. Carroll found herself transported back to a place she had convinced herself was just childhood nightmares. Cold underground rooms with sterile white walls, men in white coats holding clipboards and asking questions in voices that never seemed to care about the answers, and always the sound of machinery humming in the background like mechanical breathing that never stopped. Agent Chen had found more than just the locket in that hidden chamber. She had uncovered a file marked Subject 09 with documentation that detailed psychological conditioning protocols applied to a young girl whose real name had been systematically erased and replaced with clinical observations about cognitive retention and memory suppression techniques. The file contained audio transcription logs that made Chen's blood run cold as she read the clinical descriptions of a child begging to go home, asking for her parents, and being told by authoritative voices that proceeded with cycle reset procedures designed to fragment her memories and rebuild her identity according to specifications that served the needs of people who viewed human consciousness as nothing more than software to be programmed and reprogrammed at will. Mrs. Carroll's father, Lieutenant Colonel Harold Carroll, had not been just another officer following orders. According to the documents Chen discovered, he had been one of the primary architects of Operation Silent Brush, a psychological warfare program designed to test the limits of memory manipulation and identity reconstruction on subjects who had been selected because they had no family connections that would lead to questions if they disappeared. The most devastating revelation came when Mrs. Carroll realized that her entire life had been a carefully constructed fiction, that her memories of growing up overseas and attending art school in Germany were implanted suggestions designed to explain away the gaps in her recollection, and that the father she had loved and trusted had been the very person responsible for stealing her childhood and replacing it with a manufactured past that served the needs of a government program so classified that its existence had been denied for decades. The decision to investigate the discolored section of flooring in the hidden chamber came when Dante began exhibiting the same focused alertness that had led to the initial discovery, his steel-gray eyes fixed on that particular spot with an intensity that Officer Daniels had learned never to ignore. Agent Chen authorized the excavation after ground-penetrating radar confirmed the presence of a hollow space approximately 15 feet below the chamber floor, and when the specialized cutting tools finally breached the reinforced concrete, they revealed a metal ladder descending into darkness so complete that their tactical flashlights seemed to be swallowed by the void like light, falling into a black hole. The air that rushed up from below carried with it the stench of decades-old institutional neglect mixed with something far more sinister, a chemical signature that made the hazmat specialists exchange worried glances and immediately call for upgraded breathing apparatus that could filter out whatever toxins had been accumulating in this subterranean tomb for over 40 years. Rodriguez was the first to descend, his heavy boots ringing against the metal rungs as he disappeared into the abyss, with nothing but a tactical flashlight and a radio connection to the surface world that seemed increasingly fragile as his voice began to echo through chambers that had never been designed for human habitation, but rather for purposes so dark that their very existence challenged everything. The investigators thought they knew about the limits of government experimentation on its own citizens. What Rodriguez found at the bottom of that ladder was a complex of interconnected rooms that stretched beneath Fairhaven like the roots of some monstrous tree, each chamber dedicated to a specific aspect of the psychological warfare program that had operated in complete secrecy while the children of Lincoln Middle School attended classes directly above, completely unaware that their playground sat on top of one of the most horrific human experimentation facilities in American history. The first room contained banks of monitoring equipment, their screens dark, but their presence suggesting a level of surveillance and data collection that would have been cutting edge for the 1970s, with cables running through conduits in the walls that led to other chambers where the actual experiments had taken place. The second chamber was lined with what appeared to be observation windows, one-way mirrors that allowed researchers to monitor subjects without being seen, and when Rodriguez shined his flashlight through the glass, he discovered rooms that had been designed to simulate various environments. A mock classroom, a replica family home, even a small chapel complete with pews and an altar. All of them equipped with hidden cameras and recording devices that could document every aspect of a subject's behavior under controlled conditions. The most disturbing discovery came in the third chamber, where Rodriguez found a series of isolation cells, each one barely large enough for a single occupant, with reinforced steel doors that could only be opened from the outside, and small viewing slots that allowed constant observation of the subjects confined within these psychological pressure chambers, designed to break down individual identity and rebuild it according to the specifications of military researchers who viewed human consciousness as nothing more than a complex biological computer that could be reprogrammed through the systematic application of psychological torture disguised as scientific research. At the far end of this underground complex, Rodriguez's flashlight illuminated a final door marked with radiation warnings and biohazard symbols that suggested the experiments conducted at this facility had extended far beyond simple psychological conditioning into areas of human experimentation that violated every international treaty governing the treatment of research subjects. And as his radio crackled with static from the interference of whatever shielding surrounded this deepest chamber, Rodriguez realized that what they had uncovered beneath Lincoln Middle School was not just a Cold War relic, but evidence of crimes against humanity that had been buried so deep that their perpetrators had assumed they would never see the light of justice. The breakthrough that would transform this investigation from a local mystery into a federal manhunt came when Agent Chen's team discovered a second file cabinet hidden behind a false wall in the deepest chamber, its contents revealing that Mrs. Carroll had not been the only victim of Operation Silent Brush, but merely one subject in a program that had systematically destroyed the lives of dozens of children over the course of nearly a decade. The files were meticulously organized, each folder containing the complete psychological profile and conditioning history of subjects identified only by numbers, their real names erased so completely that even their handlers referred to them as statistical data points rather than human beings with families and futures that had been stolen from them in the name of national security. Subject 10 was particularly haunting, her file containing photographs of a dark-haired girl with oversized eyes that seemed to stare accusingly from the yellowed pages, and the clinical notes described a child who had been taken from an orphanage in 1982 and subjected to memory fragmentation protocols so extreme that she had eventually retreated into complete psychological isolation. Her final status listed simply as disappeared with no follow-up documentation to indicate whether she had escaped, died, or been permanently confined to some classified facility that existed beyond the reach of civilian oversight. The discovery that sent shockwaves through the FBI team came when they found evidence that the program had not ended with the official closure of the facility in 1977, but had continued operating in a reduced capacity through a network of civilian contractors and private research institutions that maintained their connections to the original military sponsors through a web of shell companies and classified funding streams that allowed the experimentation to continue without direct government oversight. Agent Chen's hands trembled as she read transcripts of audio recordings that documented the systematic torture of children whose only crime had been their vulnerability, their lack of family connections, and their selection by researchers who viewed orphans and runaways as perfect test subjects, because no one would miss them if they vanished into the bureaucratic maze of classified military programs. The most disturbing revelation came when they discovered that several of the subjects had been placed back into society after their conditioning was complete, their memories altered, and their identities reconstructed to serve as unknowing assets who could be activated for intelligence gathering or other covert operations whenever their handlers deemed it necessary. These sleeper agents had been living normal lives for decades, working as teachers, government employees, and community leaders, while carrying within their subconscious minds the programming that could turn them into unwilling accomplices to crimes they would never remember committing. The investigation took a personal turn when Officer Daniels found a file that made his blood run cold. A document suggesting that the K-9 training program at Fairhaven had been selected specifically because dogs possessed sensory capabilities that could detect the psychological stress markers and chemical signatures left behind by the conditioning process, making them living lie detectors capable of identifying subjects who had been processed through the program even decades after their initial treatment. This explained why Dante had reacted so violently to Mrs. Carroll's painting, why his instincts had led him directly to the hidden chamber, and why he continued to exhibit heightened alertness around certain areas of the school that corresponded to locations marked on the facility blueprints as sites where subjects had been held during their conditioning cycles. The final piece of evidence that would change everything came in the form of a maintenance log from the local power plant. Documents that showed unusual electrical consumption patterns during the 1970s that corresponded exactly with the dates of subject processing cycles, confirming that the torture chamber beneath Lincoln Middle School had drawn its power directly from the municipal grid, meaning that the entire community of Fairhaven had unknowingly subsidized the electricity used to destroy the minds of innocent children in the name of Cold War psychological warfare research that violated every principle of human decency and constitutional protection. The search for Subject 10 began with a single detail that Officer Daniels almost missed, a notation in the margin of her psychological evaluation that mentioned her unusual attachment to a black and white Border Collie that had somehow found its way into the underground facility during her final weeks of conditioning, a detail so seemingly insignificant that most investigators would have dismissed it as irrelevant noise in the mountains of horrific documentation they were processing. But Daniels had spent years learning to trust the instincts of working dogs, and something about this reference to another canine presence in that chamber of horrors made him wonder if the connection between Subject 10 and her four-legged companion might be the key to finding a woman who had been missing for over 40 years. The breakthrough came when Agent Chen received a phone call from Dr. Sarah Martinez, who ran a rescue center for retired service dogs in Idaho, her voice trembling with excitement as she explained that she had seen the news coverage about Lincoln Middle School and recognized something familiar in the story. 11 years earlier, a severely traumatized border collie had appeared at her ranch, half-starved and exhibiting behavioral patterns that suggested military or police training. But when she tried to trace his origins through official channels, she encountered a wall of bureaucratic silence that suggested his history was classified at levels far above her security clearance. The dog had responded to only one name, Finn, and despite years of careful rehabilitation, he continued to exhibit hypervigilance around certain scents and sounds that Dr. Martinez could never identify, behaviors that made perfect sense when she learned about the psychological conditioning experiments that had taken place beneath Fairhaven. The decision to bring Finn to Oregon was made within hours, Agent Chen authorizing an emergency transport that would reunite the border collie with the location where his bond with Subject 10 had been forged in the darkest circumstances imaginable, hoping that his extraordinary sensory abilities might lead them to a woman whose survival could provide the testimony needed to bring justice to the perpetrators of Operation Silent Brush. When Finn arrived at Lincoln Middle School, his reaction was immediate and devastating, the normally calm rescue dog becoming agitated the moment his paws touched the pavement of the parking lot, his nose working overtime as he processed scent markers that had been embedded in his memory during the most traumatic period of his life. Officer Daniels watched in fascination as Finn ignored the main building entirely and headed straight for an area behind the school where ground-penetrating radar had detected additional underground structures that had not yet been excavated, his behavior so focused and determined that it seemed as if he were following a map written in molecules that only he could read. The most extraordinary moment came when Mrs. Carroll, still recovering from the shock of learning about her own victimization, approached Finn with trembling hands and whispered a name that she claimed had appeared in her dreams for decades without any conscious understanding of its significance. "Emily," she said softly, and Finn's reaction was instantaneous, his ears snapping forward and his entire body trembling with recognition, as if that single word had unlocked memories that had been buried even deeper than the psychological conditioning could reach. Agent Chen immediately issued a nationwide alert for any woman named Emily who might be connected to the Fairhaven area or who exhibited the behavioral markers associated with severe psychological trauma and memory suppression. But the real breakthrough came 3 days later when a security camera at a homeless shelter in Portland captured footage of a woman with dark hair and haunted eyes standing beside a familiar black and white border collie, both of them staring directly into the camera lens, as if they had been waiting decades for someone to finally start looking for them in the right places. The Portland homeless shelter, where Emily had been spotted, was a place where society's forgotten gathered each night, seeking temporary refuge from the harsh realities of life on the streets. But when Agent Chen and Officer Daniels arrived with Finn in tow, they discovered that this particular woman had never actually stayed inside the building, but rather maintained a vigilant watch from the shadows across the street, as if decades of conditioning had taught her that safety could only be found in constant movement and perpetual alertness. The shelter director, a weathered woman named Margaret, who had worked with the homeless population for over 20 years, recognized Emily immediately when shown the security footage, explaining in hushed tones that the mysterious woman had been appearing sporadically for nearly a decade, always accompanied by her border collie companion, always watching but never trusting enough to come inside where help was available. Margaret described Emily as a ghost who seemed to exist between worlds, neither fully connected to society nor completely lost to it, displaying behaviors that suggested severe psychological trauma, but possessing an intelligence and awareness that indicated her mind had not been completely shattered by whatever horrors she had endured in her past. The first attempt to make contact failed when Emily spotted the federal agents and disappeared into the urban maze of Portland's industrial district, but Finn's reaction to her scent trail was so intense that Daniels knew they were on the right track, the border collie exhibiting the same focused determination he had shown at Lincoln Middle School as he led the search team through abandoned warehouses and forgotten alleyways where the city's most vulnerable citizens sought invisibility from authorities who had failed them too many times before. The breakthrough came when Mrs. Carroll insisted on joining the search, her presence somehow essential to what Agent Chen was beginning to understand was not just a law enforcement operation, but a rescue mission that required the participation of someone who had survived the same psychological conditioning and could serve as a bridge between Emily's fragmented memories and the reality of her current situation. When they finally found Emily 3 days later, she was sitting in an abandoned building that had once housed a textile factory, her back against a brick wall, while Finn lay protectively at her side, both of them watching the entrance with the hypervigilance of survivors who had learned that danger could appear without warning and trust was a luxury they could never afford. The moment Emily saw Mrs. Carroll approaching slowly with her hands visible and empty, something shifted in her haunted eyes. A flicker of recognition that suggested the psychological programming had not completely erased the connections between subjects who had shared the same nightmare experiences in those underground chambers 4 decades earlier. The first words Emily spoke were barely audible, her voice hoarse from years of disuse and trauma, but when she whispered, "I remember the blue room," Mrs. Carroll's face crumpled with understanding, and she knelt beside Emily with tears streaming down her cheeks as she replied, "I remember it too, and I remember you." The reunion between Emily and Finn was heartbreaking to witness, the border collie pressing against his human companion with desperate affection, while Emily buried her face in his fur and sobbed with a grief that had been suppressed for so long that its release seemed to shake the very foundations of the abandoned building where they had taken shelter. Agent Chen documented every moment of this encounter, knowing that Emily's testimony could provide the evidence needed to pursue justice against those responsible for Operation Silent Brush, but understanding that healing would have to come before any legal proceedings could begin, and that the road back from 4 decades of psychological exile would require patience, compassion, and the unwavering support of people who understood that some wounds run deeper than law enforcement can reach. The story of Lincoln Middle School's dark secret spread across the nation like wildfire within weeks of the initial discovery. But what most people never learned were the smaller, equally haunting details that emerged as the FBI's investigation expanded into a comprehensive examination of Cold War-era human experimentation, programs that had operated in facilities across the United States. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a forensic psychologist specializing in trauma recovery, was brought in to work with both Mrs. Carroll and Emily, and her preliminary reports revealed behavioral patterns that suggested the psychological conditioning had been far more sophisticated than anyone initially realized, incorporating techniques that wouldn't be fully understood by mainstream psychology for another 2 decades. The most chilling discovery came when investigators found evidence that Operation Silent Brush had been just one component of a larger program called Project Looking Glass, which had established similar facilities in at least 7 other states, each one hidden beneath seemingly innocent public buildings like schools, libraries, and community centers where children could be observed and selected for participation in experiments that violated every principle of medical ethics and human decency. Agent Chen's team uncovered financial records showing that the program had been funded through a complex network of defense contractors and pharmaceutical companies who had been eager to test the limits of psychological manipulation for both military and commercial applications, with some of the research eventually finding its way into advertising techniques and political propaganda methods that were still being used decades later. The media attention brought forward other survivors, including a man in his 60s who had been held at a facility beneath a public library in Michigan during the 1960s, and a woman from Texas who had recovered fragmented memories of being subjected to experimental drug protocols in an underground chamber hidden beneath what is now a senior center, their testimonies painting a picture of systematic abuse that had affected hundreds of children across multiple generations. Officer Daniels received dozens of calls from K-9 handlers around the country who reported similar incidents where their dogs had exhibited unusual behavior around certain government buildings or public facilities, suggesting that the K-9 ability to detect psychological trauma markers might be far more widespread and useful than anyone had previously understood, leading to the development of new training protocols that could help identify other hidden sites where experiments might have taken place. The most surprising development came when a retired CIA analyst named Robert Chen, who shared no relation to Agent Chen despite the identical surname, came forward with documents he had secretly preserved for over 30 years. Papers that proved high-ranking government officials had been fully aware of the illegal nature of these experiments, but had authorized their continuation anyway, arguing that the potential military applications outweighed the ethical concerns about using American children as test subjects. Dante became something of a celebrity, with his story inspiring a new generation of K-9 training programs specifically designed to help dogs detect sites where historical trauma had occurred, and Officer Daniels found himself traveling across the country to train other handlers in recognizing the subtle behavioral cues that could lead to discoveries of buried secrets that powerful people had assumed would never see the light of day. The international implications became clear when similar programs were discovered in allied countries, suggesting that Operation Silent Brush had been part of a coordinated effort involving intelligence agencies from multiple nations, all of them working together to develop psychological warfare techniques that could be used against enemy populations, while simultaneously testing the methods on their own citizens to ensure maximum effectiveness when deployed in foreign theaters of operation. 2 years after Dante's fateful bark shattered the silence in room 114, Fair Haven had transformed from a quiet suburban community into a symbol of resilience in the face of unimaginable betrayal. But the questions raised by the discovery beneath Lincoln Middle School continued to reverberate through the highest levels of government and into the deepest corners of the American conscience, challenging everything citizens thought they knew about the institutions they had been taught to trust without question. The school itself had been converted into a memorial and research center dedicated to uncovering other sites where similar experiments might have taken place, with Dante serving as the facility's chief detection officer, his extraordinary abilities now recognized as a crucial tool in the ongoing effort to expose decades of buried government crimes against the most vulnerable members of society. Mrs. Carroll and Emily had both undergone extensive psychological rehabilitation, their recovery serving as a beacon of hope for other survivors who were slowly coming forward from the shadows where they had hidden for decades, afraid to speak the truth about experiences that sounded too horrific for anyone to believe, until concrete evidence made denial impossible. The legal proceedings that followed resulted in the largest settlement in the history of human experimentation lawsuits, with surviving victims receiving not just financial compensation, but also access to cutting-edge medical treatment designed to help repair the psychological damage inflicted by techniques that had been deliberately designed to fragment human consciousness and rebuild it according to the specifications of researchers who viewed children as nothing more than biological raw material for their twisted experiments. Officer Daniels had been promoted to head a new federal task force dedicated to training K-9 units, specifically for the detection of historical trauma sites. His partnership with Dante serving as the gold standard for handlers across the country who were learning to recognize the subtle behavioral cues that could lead to discoveries of secrets that had been buried so deep that their perpetrators believed they would never be found. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation came in the final months of the investigation, when Agent Chen's team discovered evidence that suggested Operation Silent Brush and Project Looking Glass had never actually been terminated, but rather had evolved into more sophisticated programs that operated through private contractors and academic institutions, continuing their work on psychological manipulation and mind control, using methods that were even more advanced than the crude techniques employed in the underground chambers of the 1970s. The implications of this discovery sent shockwaves through Congress, leading to the establishment of a permanent oversight committee dedicated to monitoring government-sponsored research involving human subjects. But critics argued that such measures were meaningless as long as the intelligence agencies retained the ability to classify their activities at levels that placed them beyond the reach of civilian oversight or constitutional protection. As our story draws to a close, we find Dante and Officer Daniels continuing their work, traveling from town to town across America. Their mission no longer just about solving crimes, but about healing wounds that run deeper than individual trauma, wounds that speak to the very soul of a nation that must confront the darkness in its own history before it can claim any moral authority to judge the actions of other countries or governments. The final image that haunts those who lived through this discovery is not of the underground chambers or the classified documents or even the tears of the survivors, but of a simple question that echoes through the halls of power in Washington and into the dreams of every parent who sends their children to school each morning. If this could happen in Fair Haven, if it could remain hidden for over 40 years beneath the feet of innocent children, what other secrets are still buried beneath our most trusted institutions, waiting for the right dog, the right moment, the right combination of courage and circumstance to bring them finally into the light, where justice can begin its long, difficult work of making the powerful accountable for the suffering they have inflicted upon the powerless in the name of national security and scientific progress.